80 years ago, victory in the World Anti-Fascist War marked a turning point in human history. The Chinese People's War of Resistance against Japanese aggression was the first major conflict and the longest-running campaign in the World Anti-Fascist War. As the world reflects on the lessons of history today, let's delve into this part of history with Professor Hans van der Ven from the University of Cambridge, one of the first Western scholars to articulate China's decisive role in the Second World War systematically. So welcome, Professor. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Hello, Huilan. Thank you very much for having me on your program. I'm delighted to be here.
In your work, you've challenged the traditional Western narratives of the Second World War, which have often downplayed the strategic importance of the Chinese theater. What led you to question this prevailing framework and retell China's wartime story?
Well, essentially, my conviction very early on, when I still was a PhD student actually, was that it may be true that China contributed very little to the final defeat in 1945 of Japan, but obviously the war was hugely important to China itself. There was a vast amount of suffering, the number of refugees, the political changes, ultimately the demise of the nationalists, the rise of the Chinese communists. These changes were enormous. It was easy for me to come to that conclusion as I grew up in the Netherlands. Now, the Netherlands obviously had no impact on the defeat of Germany. I mean, clearly not. But growing up in the Netherlands, it was absolutely clear to me that the impact of the war in the Netherlands itself was huge. You couldn't understand Dutch history without thinking about the period of German occupation, the Allied war against Germany, and so on and so on. So I think that pointed to the reality that in the West, in America and the UK, mostly at the time, the Second World War was very much written from the perspective from the US and the UK as the great victors. Well, actually, much more is going on than that. I'm going to tell you about it. And there was, this coincided with the opening up of archives, that is late 1980s, 1990s, especially in Nanjing, but also in Taipei, in which there's voluminous documentation to tell us about what happened in China during the Second World War. And, being an historian, confronting voluminous documentation, I had many happy days, weeks, months, working in the archives that allowed me to help to tell this story.
Some scholars have viewed China as more like a passive victim or a beneficiary of the Allied support, instead of recognizing its active resistance against Japanese aggression. So from your research on those documentation that you just mentioned, what key aspects of China's resistance have been most overlooked or misunderstood?
There's a lot that has been overlooked, but I'll name just two or three things. I think, first of all, China was the first really to stand up to Japanese military aggression. This is, of course, in 1937, or in some ways before that. And that was at a time when the US was isolationist and actually was selling a vast amount of oil to Japan, without which Japan would not have been able to wage its war of aggression. The UK too was very much focused on events in Europe, and I think the fact that the nationalists, together with the Chinese communists at this point, decided to resist Japan's aggression was, and I think this is actually overlooked in China too, was quite inspirational to people across Asia, believing that the days of Western empires were doomed. There were responses to what China was doing in 1937 in Indonesia, in India, and elsewhere, by people like Nehru, by Susan Shahrir, and so on. And they thought, actually, this shows that that our masters can't be trusted to protect us, which neither the Dutch, the French, or the British were doing, and that we must stand on our own feet. So I think a big impetus on independence movements in Asia itself And I think that deserves more recognition in China itself. China at this time was the home of a lot of independence movement leaders from across Asia. Ho Chi Minh from Vietnam is just one example. So I think that's one thing. I think the other thing in which China's resistance has been underestimated is in the latter part of the war. In 1943, the Allies met Churchill, Chiang Kai-shek, Stalin, and Roosevelt met in Cairo and in Tehran. And the US and the UK believed that defeating Japan would be very easy. They were sort of Japan is not going to, we'll first defeat Germany, and then all of us will defeat Japan, and the war will be over, be very quick, and it will be end by 1944. Of course, that proved completely wrong. And in 1944, China resisted Japan's Yusankui-Jantan, the Ichigo offensive in Japanese, as it is also known in English. And that was a big fight. And I think the strength of China's determination to continue to fight, despite the horrors over so many years, despite all the refugee movements, despite the fact that there was famine in Hunan and so on, says something about China's determination to really resist Japan and to create a new independent Chinese nation. So I think that was very significant. In 1945, there were surrender ceremonies, first of all in Tokyo, provided over by the Americans, in Singapore, and then of course there was one in Nanjing as well. The surrender ceremony took place, began at 9 a.m. on the 9th day of the 9th month. It was symbolically very significant, Zhou Zhou Zhou.
Yeah.
So the idea is that peace will last forever, but it was also saying we are now an independent nation, because 999 also echoes 11/11/11. So the 11th of November, 11 a.m. of the 11th of November, which is when the armistice of the First World War began. And so I think these two events they echoed each other, were made to echo each other. And so we want a kind of new world emerging out of this, in which China will not be treated like it was in Paris, but will be a proper independent nation, making its own future. And I think that too had an impact, or that expressed something that was happening across Asia at the time, where people like Sukarno and Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam were declaring their independence as well. So on the one hand, in Tokyo, you have the UK, the USA especially, but also the UK and France and the Dutch, saying we're going to reshape Asia as it was before the war, as a colonial Asia, and China saying, no, we're not doing that. And so I think it's worth emphasizing that the ideas about the future of not just China, but Asia was rather different in the Nanjing surrender ceremony.
So you've stressed the importance of understanding China's wartime experience within its specific historical and geographical context, rather than through the lens of modern warfare. So what made China's wartime experience unique, and how did it shape the developments of the post-war world?
I think it's often easy to forget that the Second World War, we think of the Second World War as something very modern. But in reality, China at the time was a very agricultural country. There was no little industry. People were not well educated. There was a lot of poverty. And I think it shared that with other areas in Asia, like India, Vietnam, Burma, as well as Indonesia. So it shared that. But that made it rather different from the American and the European experience of war. China, like other Asian countries really, had to fight a modern industrial national war at the same time that its economy remained very agricultural. And that caused a tension. A modern war is enormously demanding of resources, of food, for instance, but also of people, of manpower, but also of minerals, of coal, of iron. And it just could not deliver, the rural society could not deliver the means by which to fight a modern war, but Japan, of course, could do so. And I think that tension between a pre-modern economy and the demands of modern war caused the enormous suffering, which remains not fully recognized, I think, in the West, in China, as well as in India and Indonesia. So that makes it very different from the Western way of war. At the same time, China's leaders, and I think here the communists and nationalists were the same, were just simply not going to give in to Japan's military aggression. They were now going to stand up for, we must fight rather than compromise. If we compromise, we will be lost forever. China as a civilization will be lost forever. If we fight and we lose, there will be, at some point in the future, China will revive itself. So this was about establishing a Chinese determination to stand up for China. And without it, who knows what would happen? But it's entirely possible that Japan would have established its dominance in China, that some accommodation would have been found, but that did not happen. So I think that determination to persist in fighting military aggression really is very important and helped recreate a new modern world.
Yeah. China had suffered quite a lot during that part of history, and even with the scarcity of resources, as you mentioned, and a less developed economic situation, China dragged Japan into a prolonged war, and it finally, won this war. You've mentioned that the Second World War has brought far more changes to Asia than to Europe. We wonder what prompted this observation and what are these major changes or lasting legacies?
The most important change is that Asia changed from a continent, an area of the world that was dominated by empire, especially European empires, but also then later joined by Japan. And I would class the US also as an empire, the Philippines, for instance. It changed from that into an area of the world in which the nation state became the basic unit of political organization. That's a huge change, an enormous change. So instead of an Asia dominated by the British, the French, the Dutch, the Japanese, and the Americans, you have an Asia in which you have so many nation states of Pakistan, Burma, the Philippines, China, Korea, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia itself. And so that's a huge change. And I think when I speak to European or American audiences, that is the same change that happened in Europe after the First World War. Mm-hmm. Eastern Europe was Europe was dominated by empires. The Russian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, Austria-Hungary, the British Empire. And then after the First World War, you get a creation of new nation states. That same process occurred in Asia during and after the Second World War. So that's one way in which the changes were deeper, I think, in the Second World War in Asia than in Europe. The other was that Asia had revolutions. They came out of the Second World War. Mm-hmm. And in Europe, in the First World War, during and after the First World War, you have revolutions. You have revolutions in Russia. Russia became the Soviet Union. You had a revolution in Germany, which failed. There were revolutionary movements in various other places, but and the same happened in China, in Asia. You had, of course, the Communist Revolution in China. Can debate to what extent the Indonesian independence movement is a revolution or not. You could say the same about what happened in Burma. I think clearly in Vietnam you have a revolution. So, but none of those things happened in Europe after the Second World War. But they did in Asia. And of course, we're still living with the consequences of that. So in some ways, I think you can say that the First World War is an actual moment in European history. Europe changed profoundly. And I think the the Second World War in Asia is the same kind of actual moment that really did change Asia completely from this continent dominated by empire and so on into one of nation states. Our lives are fundamentally shaped. Our lives, I mean, I lived part of the time in China, so I can say Asian realities are fundamentally shaped by the Second World War, more so, I think, than European or American lives.
Yeah, so for this continent, it's more of a complex interplay of many societal factors, not just wars, but revolutions themselves.
And the revolutions are closely connected to the war itself.
So in recent years, historians have begun to pay more attention to the Eastern theater when studying the Second World War, contributing to a more global understanding of this war. So why is adopting a global perspective so important when we study this war?
And it's hugely important. And the Second World War was a global war, and there were connections between Asia and Europe throughout, I think, not just after Pearl Harbor. But I think we all have grown up with books about the Second World War that talk about the Dutch in the Second World War, the British in the Second World War, the Americans in the Second World War, or China in the Second World War. People in China talk about China's contribution to the defeat of Japan. And I think it's actually, we're missing so much of the complete picture if we don't place our own country's experiences in this much wider context. And I'm going to give you one example, which I think is quite telling. When Americans talk about the beginning of the Second World War, they talk about Pearl Harbor and Tuntukan. And they talk about the Second World War sort of, it begins with Pearl Harbor. That's what you hear. Mm-hmm. In reality, the Japanese, they attacked the USA's, the Americans' Pacific Fleet, really not to attack when it was important, but the real aim was to secure the resources of the Netherlands East Indies, because in the Netherlands East Indies, you have the oil, including the kerosene refineries, that would allow the Japanese to continue war after the Americans had blocked oil exports. Now, Americans don't talk about the Netherlands East Indies when they talk about Pearl Harbor. But Pearl Harbor is a misnomer. The Japanese were after securing the Netherlands East Indies, but also, of course, Burma, where there's a lot of oil and there's a lot of food, southern Vietnam, which they had occupied. And so I think we have to, so if we don't think about the global picture, when we think about our own country's experience in the Second World War, we're going to miss so much.
So that will give us more complete picture of this whole piece of history. Recently, we've noticed some people from other countries have shared on social media about how they have learned or remembered this piece of history of China during the Second World War. Some have posted their reflections on related movies, since there have been quite a few recently. Some also wrote songs on this part of history. So I wonder, as a scholar, how do you view this phenomenon of people actively seeking out and sharing the information about this piece of history?
It's kind of like people-to-people diplomacy, isn't it? It's sort of a broadening of the realm of people who talk about the Second World War. I think it's great, and it's not just because there will be lots of information coming through social media, or memoirs, or family recollections, and so on. That in itself is very useful, but it's also interesting because it tells us about how the Second World War, the ideas about it are transmitted from one generation to the next. And I think that is very interesting. And it's something that as academic historians, we should be probably much more attuned to than we are. And it's sort of, it's interesting. It's really interesting, I think, because one of the questions I have is, why is it that the Second World War continues to have such an enormous hold on our minds, on our recollections, on how we think about ourselves, on our identities. There have been lots of wars afterwards, some equally horrible, like the Vietnam War, between Vietnam and the United States, and of course recently, what's happening in the Middle East and so on. But it's still the Second World War that keeps having all the attention politically, I think at a high level, but also in families. And I think that itself, how those memories change over time and what people do with them itself is simply really interesting.
That is your question currently for studying this topic.
Yeah, this becomes memory studies, and there's lots of work on that. Mm-hmm. But this is how does an event like the first generation? Well, the first generation didn't really talk about it. Then they talk to their grandchildren, mm-hmm. And then conversations do begin. And I think that's the same in Europe as it is in Asia. But then these memories become changed as they become consolidated into textbooks, into monuments, into film, into museums, and so on. And so they take on a very different. They become part of a genuine part of a collective memory that sustains certain ideas, certain identities, certain moral ideas. And I think that's a process that's well worth watching and thinking about.
Yeah. I remember you once remarked that it takes about 3 generations.
It does, yes, at least.
Yeah. So in summary, what lessons can we draw from history of the Second World War? And in your view, what is the appropriate approach for understanding war and peace in the present?
I guess the basic lesson is don't do it again. Just not a good idea. I think one lesson, to put it perhaps a bit more philosophically, the Second World War, you begin a war because you think you can control the outcome. And Japan is an example of that, right? Actually, the Japanese leaders knew they might well lose, but still went to war thinking they could win. I think the reality of war, of this kind of war, this kind of total war, is that you do not control the outcome. It is beyond human capacity, and I'm sure it's beyond AI's capacity. Once you begin fighting on this kind of scale, with this kind of intensity, with this kind of damage, all kinds of things are going to happen that you will not predict and you will not control. Now, I think I say this as a lesson because, of course, many political leaders, they used to have a lot of knowledge about history. They no longer do. But for instance, in the United States, during the Vietnam War, people, at the time, a lot of American leaders in the military and so on thought that they would be able to control the outcome of the Vietnam War, and they collected all the data and they said, look, we are winning. If we just have to go on and we are winning, we can control this. This is McNamara. And in fact, they were losing. And so I think this uncontrollability of war or of the future is something we should keep very much in mind. And the idea of war as a kind of project that you can manage and bring to a happy conclusion is kind of a falseness, a false consciousness, and the more that people remember that, the better. And I don't want to have to learn it again. Just don't.
We should cherish this hard-won peace. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Cherish peace, and I think, yeah. And so in war too, what happens in war is that you get two sides, you and the enemy.
Mm-hmm.
There is no middle ground. There is no compromise.
Yeah.
There is no ability for the two sides to connect and work together. Mm-hmm. I think that kind of very binary, dichotomous approach to thinking about the world is a great danger. We don't have to be, the choice is not between friends and enemies, as a German philosopher once put it. It's more complicated.
Yeah.
Like, you know, there's so much opportunity for compromise, and we're far better to do that than.
Sure. Thanks so much for sharing your insights and also your questions into this piece of history. We truly appreciate your time, and this is quite a insightful dialogue. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Huela, and thank you for having me on your program.